death on the Christmas Rink. Snow fell softly over the village of St. Mary Mead, like a delicate lace shawl laid tenderly across the rooftops. The thatched cottages, each outlined with a faint frosting of white, seemed to stand to attention under the weight of the December twilight. A chill wind pressed against the window panes, and in the distance, the bell of St. Mary's Church chimed 5 times, its gentle tolling carried through the air like a solemn carol. It was the week before Christmas, and the village, though quaint and ordinary in its way, had rarely felt so festive. A temporary skating rink had been built on the village green, a novelty that had set everyone chattering. It was nothing grand, of course, nothing like the fine rinks in London, but to the villagers, it might as well have been the Royal Albert Hall. Wooden boards and clear ice, strung round with fairy lights and paper lanterns, made the heart of the village gleam like a scene from an illustrated Christmas card. The planning committee, led by Mrs. Penelope Hargrave, chairwoman of the St. Mary Mead Winter Committee, had been up to their elbows in preparations for weeks. There were mulled wine stalls, carol singers, a brass band for Christmas Eve, and of course, the skating competition scheduled for the night before Christmas Eve. It was to be the highlight of the season. And it was precisely here that Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her favourite armchair at the window of her neat little house on Old Mill Lane, sipped her evening tea and observed with her usual sharp interest. Miss Marple, white-haired, with her soft shawl tucked carefully round her shoulders, had lived in the village long enough to know that under every charming veneer of Christmas good cheer lay human hearts, often just as flawed as at any other time of year. And Christmas, in her long experience, had a way of bringing out not only goodwill but also envy, resentment, and the occasional dangerous secret. She set her cup down gently on its saucer, leaning slightly forward to see through the swirling snow. She could just make out the bobbing figure of young Tommy Pierce, one of the local lads, racing past the green. A small boy with red cheeks and a knitted cap, Tommy had been running errands for Mrs. Hargrave all afternoon. His enthusiasm was so sincere that it made Miss Marple smile. "Such a dear boy," she murmured to herself. Though enthusiasm and mischief often walk hand in hand. She adjusted her shawl. Christmas in St. Mary Mead was rarely dull. The Christmas Rink and the Hargrave family. By 6 o'clock that evening, the rink was alight with strings of golden bulbs. Laughter and music carried through the frosty air. Villagers, wrapped in scarves and wool coats, skated clumsily or watched from the edges with cups of hot punch. The Hargraves stood proudly near the entrance, greeting everyone with the practiced warmth of village gentry. Penelope Hargrave, slender, silver-haired, and always a touch too composed, was the undisputed queen of the committee. Her husband, Colonel Arthur Hargrave, retired, stood a few paces behind, puffing gently on his pipe and nodding approvingly at the proceedings. Their only son, Peter Hargrave, handsome and recently returned from London, stood with a glass of mulled wine in hand, charming the young ladies with his easy smile. And then there was Clarissa Vaughan. Clarissa, a woman in her early 30s with dark auburn hair and a fur-lined coat, had come to St. Mary Mead only recently. She had taken the old mill house after its previous tenant passed away. With her London accent and air of sophisticated mystery, she had been the talk of the village since September. It was whispered she had been a stage actress, or perhaps a singer. No one knew for certain, though everyone had their theories. What was certain was that Peter Hargrave seemed very taken with her. Miss Marple, who had decided to make a brief appearance at the opening, observed Clarissa as she glided onto the ice. She was graceful, almost professional, drawing admiring looks from all around. Penelope Hargrave's face, Miss Marple noticed, tightened almost imperceptibly when she saw her son's eyes fixed on Clarissa. Mother-in-law prospects. Miss Marple thought with quiet amusement. They so rarely approve of actresses. Also present that evening was Reverend Lionel Kent, the village vicar, a mild, earnest man who seemed perpetually anxious about something or other. And beside him, his sister, Miss Beatrice Kent, a tall, austere woman with a knack for finding fault in anything remotely cheerful. She disapproved of skating, of Christmas frivolity, and most of all, of Clarissa Vaughan's crimson lipstick. And finally, there was Dr. Edmund Blake, the village doctor, a man in his early 40s, sharp-eyed, unmarried, and well-respected. He was often seen at the Hargraves' social events, and was rumoured to have had a mild attachment to Penelope in their younger years. Miss Marple tucked these details away in the quiet filing cabinets of her mind. People, she always said, were endlessly fascinating, and when something went wrong, and in her experience, something often did, it was rarely by accident. A subtle unease, It was nearly 7:30 when the first real note of discord slipped into the evening's carol. Penelope Hargrave, her cheeks flushed from both cold and mild agitation, approached Clarissa Vaughan with the brittle smile of a woman determined to be civil. "My dear Miss Vaughan," she said, in a voice sugared but sharp at the edges, "I do hope you're enjoying our little village festivities. Not quite Covent Garden, but we do our best." Clarissa's red lips curved. "Oh, I think it's absolutely delightful. I've never seen anything quite so charming." Her words, though perfectly polite, carried the faintest air of amusement. Penelope's fingers tightened on her fur muff. Peter, arriving just in time to hear the exchange, grinned broadly. "Clarissa's been skating rings round everyone, mother. You should have seen old Mr. Briggs trying to keep up." The laugh that followed was easy, genuine, and slightly too loud. But Miss Marple, who happened to be nearby, did not miss the flicker in Penelope's eyes. Envy, yes, but also something colder. Disapproval. Perhaps even fear. "Family complications," Miss Marple murmured to herself, pretending to examine a tray of mince pies. "They can be dreadfully untidy." Reverend Kent approached at that moment, nervously adjusting his scarf. "I must say, Mrs. Hargrave, this is quite splendid. A most unusual idea. Ice skating in St. Mary Mead. Never would have thought it." "Indeed, Reverend," Penelope replied tightly, "though I do believe it brings the village together. Or tears it apart." Miss Beatrice Kent muttered from beside him. A sudden stillness. As the clock of St. Mary's struck 8, the cold seemed to deepen. The laughter and chatter on the rink grew louder as skaters spun and stumbled. Clarissa Vaughan, in her red scarf and elegant coat, twirled near the center of the rink, radiant in the golden light. Then it happened. A sound, not loud but sharp, cut through the evening air, a crack like something splintering, then a soft, strangled cry. Clarissa fell. It was not the sort of fall that happens to an inexperienced skater. No flailing arms or comic wobbling. She crumpled gracefully but unnaturally, her legs folding beneath her, her body collapsing onto the ice like a puppet whose strings had been cut. For a moment, the crowd laughed, thinking it a dramatic flourish. Then came the silence. A woman screamed. Peter Hargrave was the first to reach her. "Clarissa!" he cried, dropping to his knees on the slick ice. The color had drained from her face. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the lanterns above, and in the delicate white frost, a faint dark stain spread from her gloved hand. Dr. Blake was already pushing through the crowd. "Make room," he barked, his medical bag in hand. He knelt swiftly beside her, checked her pulse, then her throat. His face shifted from urgency to something stiller, colder. "She's dead," he said quietly. A hush fell across the green. The music stopped. Somewhere, the brass band's tuba let out a mournful wheeze. Miss Marple stood very still. She had seen enough death in her long life to recognize its quiet arrival. But this was not an accident. She had been watching. Clarissa had not skated onto a weak patch of ice. She had not slipped on a stray glove. No, she had glided, and then dropped as if struck down by something unseen. And it was then, with the lantern light gleaming faintly on the snow, that Miss Marple noticed the small silver brooch, an intricate snowflake, clutched in Clarissa Vaughan's gloved hand. She had not been wearing a brooch. Whispers in the cold. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring, some in tears, others in shock. Colonel Hargrave barked orders for people to go home. Mrs. Hargrave stood rigid, her mouth a thin line. Peter refused to leave Clarissa's side until Dr. Blake and a constable gently led him away. Reverend Kent muttered prayers under his breath. Beatrice Kent announced loudly that this was what came of modern entertainments. No one answered her. Miss Marple remained on the sidelines, her blue eyes calm, observant, bright. She had already noted several things. The brooch in Clarissa's hand. The faint scent of bitter almonds when Dr. Blake leaned close to her. The curious absence of one particular person from the initial commotion. Mrs. Penelope Hargrave had disappeared for several minutes, returning only after Dr. Blake declared Clarissa dead. And Peter Hargrave's reaction, genuine grief, yes, but also guilt, panic. She turned toward the constable, a young man named Jack Lenton, who looked pale and uncertain in the face of a death at a Christmas FT. "It will be best, young man," she said gently, "to keep everyone who was here tonight easily reachable. Sudden deaths are tricky things, so easy for a vital clue to slip away." Jack Lenton, who respected Miss Marple's quiet authority more than he cared to admit, nodded quickly. "Yes, Miss Marple. I'll speak to the inspector." An evening of unsettling thoughts. By 10 o'clock, Miss Marple was back in her parlor, the fire crackling softly. She sat with her knitting, though the needles barely moved. Her mind was far away from woolen socks. Clarissa Vaughan, so young, so beautiful, so dead. She was not a woman who inspired indifference. Penelope Hargrave disliked her. Peter adored her. Reverend Kent blushed whenever she spoke to him. Beatrice Kent loathed her openly. And Dr. Blake, his reaction had been curiously composed. Too composed, perhaps. Poison, I should think, Miss Marple murmured to the empty room. Bitter almonds. Cyanide, most likely. Though why on earth at a skating rink? She glanced at the small notebook she kept by the fireside, ostensibly for shopping lists, but more often for observations. She wrote in her neat, looping hand, Clarissa Vaughan, sudden collapse on ice rink, bitter almond scent, brooch not hers. Time 8:00 p.m. Present Penelope H. Colonel H. Peter H. Reverend Kent, Beatrice Kent, Dr. Blake. Possible opportunity. She paused, then added Clarissa had secrets. The village has gossip. Where there is gossip, there is truth. Somewhere in the muddle. She tapped her pen thoughtfully against her chin. Outside, the snow continued to fall. In the distance, she heard the faint creak of the constable's boots as he patrolled the village green, now silent and empty except for the faint outline on the ice where Clarissa had fallen. Introductions and underlying currents over the following hour. Word of the tragedy spread like wildfire. The Black Swan Inn was abuzz with whispered speculations. Heart attack, said one. No, it was the ice, said another. I heard it was poison, whispered Mrs. Finch, the postmistress. Bitter almonds, someone said. That's what they say with cyanide. Meanwhile, in Hargrave House, a grand but slightly chilly Georgian manor, Penelope Hargrave sat alone in the drawing-room, a brandy untouched at her elbow. Colonel Hargrave paced near the window. This will bring no end of scandal, Penelope said quietly. At our Christmas FT, how could this have happened? Colonel Hargrave, whose military experience had not prepared him for village gossip, scowled. Clarissa Vaughan. That woman was trouble from the start. And upstairs, Peter Hargrave sat on the edge of his bed, Clarissa's red scarf still in his hand. Miss Marple takes note. Miss Marple, of course, had no intention of letting things unfold in chaos. She had long since learned that in moments like these, the truth had a tendency to hide beneath panic and speculation. She thought carefully about each of the key players. Penelope Hargrave, jealous of Clarissa's closeness with her son, motive family pride, opportunity she had vanished during the critical moments. Colonel Hargrave, disapproved of Clarissa, motive, but opportunity uncertain. Peter Hargrave, in love with Clarissa, but love could soar, motive unclear. Reverend Kent, weak-hearted, but Clarissa's attention may have stirred something in him, possibly manipulated. Beatrice Kent, vocal in her dislike, unlikely to have had access to poison, but one never knew. Edmund Blake, calm at the scene, a man with knowledge of poisons. And then, there was Clarissa Vaughan herself. A woman with a past, no doubt. Perhaps someone else from that past had found her here, in this quiet village. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People, she often said, have such a habit of believing that evil only comes from outside. But it is rarely the stranger who brings it in the door. More often than not, it is already sitting at the hearth. The inciting incident settles. By the time midnight arrived, Inspector Cray of the county police had arrived. A stout man with a bulldog jaw. He took charge with an air of wary authority. But Miss Marple, who had solved far more delicate matters than most inspectors liked to admit, knew she would not need to intrude openly. A word here, a question there, a pot of tea, a memory of a similar case from years ago in Little Ditting. She closed her notebook with a soft snap. Clarissa Vaughan had died at the very center of the Christmas festivities, with a crowd of witnesses around her. And yet, it was a murder shrouded in silence, as though the snow itself had swallowed every sound that mattered. And somewhere among those familiar village faces, Penelope Hargrave's frosty smile, Peter's haunted eyes, Dr. Blake's calm composure, someone knew precisely how and why Clarissa had died. Miss Marple looked out into the night, the snow still falling gently on the darkened rink. Someone, she whispered, has been very clever indeed. Morning came cold and pale, the world outside Miss Marple's window wrapped in white silence. Snow clung to every branch and gate-post, muting even the sound of the postman's boots. The cheer of Christmas decorations, the holly wreaths, the scarlet ribbons, seemed strangely out of place now, like bright smiles forced upon sorrowful faces. In the stillness of her parlor, Miss Marple stirred her tea and read the morning paper, though she barely glanced at the print. Her mind, as usual, was busy elsewhere. Sudden death at the village rink, it would say in the Daily Chronicle. But Miss Marple, with her calm, unhurried mind, had already turned the story over from every angle. Clarissa Vaughan's sudden collapse had been ruled suspicious. Overnight, and Inspector Cray had ordered a full inquiry. The constable, young Jack Lenton, had already been sent to take statements. The body was being examined at Dr. Blake's surgery, pending the coroner's arrival. Miss Marple placed her teaspoon neatly upon the saucer. "It is never quite what it seems," she murmured. "People so rarely die without reason. And yet the reasons are almost never the ones we think." Miss Marple receives a visitor. There came a knock at the door. It was Reverend Kent, hat in hand, looking nervous, as though visiting Miss Marple was somehow akin to facing divine judgment. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, stepping into the warm sitting room, "such a dreadful business. The whole village is quite undone. Mrs. Hargrave has cancelled tonight's committee supper. One can hardly blame her." "Quite," Miss Marple said gently. "Do sit down, Reverend. A little tea." "Thank you, thank you." He perched on the edge of the armchair, clutching his hat as though afraid it might escape him. "Such a tragedy, Miss Vaughan, such a charming young lady, although, well, some thought her a little modern." Miss Marple repeated with a mild smile. "Yes, independent, you know, city ways. I dare say that unsettled some of the parish ladies." "And you, Reverend?" she asked mildly. "Did she unsettle you?" He coloured. No, not at all. Merely concerned that gossip would flourish. It always does. I tried to remind Mrs. Hargrave that charity is one of the Christian virtues, though I fear she took it as criticism." "Eh," said Miss Marple softly. "And Mrs. Hargrave does not enjoy criticism." He hesitated, then shook his head. "No indeed. But she is much to be pitied. Her son's attachment to Miss Vaughan had become quite noticeable. There was talk they might announce an engagement." Miss Marple's needles, which had been clinking quietly, paused mid-air. "An engagement? So soon?" "Apparently so," said the Reverend, sighing. Mrs. Hargrave disapproved. "Colonel Hargrave, I believe, rather more so." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Do have a scone, Reverend." Seen at the rink later that morning, Miss Marple bundled herself in her wool coat and ventured to the village green. The skating rink lay silent now, the ice dull and cloudy under the pale sun. A single constable guarded the cordoned area. Jack Lenton touched his cap when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Inspector Cray said no one's to go on the ice." "Quite right," she said approvingly. "One mustn't disturb evidence. Though I dare say, with this thaw, there won't be much left to disturb." He nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Terrible business that, and right at Christmas too." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Evil rarely keeps to the calendar." Her eyes drifted across the rink. The place where Clarissa fell was still faintly marked, a darker patch beneath the surface. Miss Marple's gaze, keen as a bird's, took in the surroundings, the refreshment stall, the bench where Mrs. Hargrave had sat earlier that evening, the patch of trampled snow where the crowd had gathered. Then something caught her eye, a small glint near the fence. She stooped carefully and picked it up. A button, silver, expensive, not from a villager's coat, she thought, but from something tailored in London. She slipped it discreetly into her pocket. The Hargrave house by noon. She found herself at Hargrave House. Mrs. Hargrave had sent word through the maid that she was quite too distraught to see anyone, but Miss Marple had her own quiet ways of gaining entry. "Only for a moment," she said to the maid, with a reassuring smile, a few words of comfort. The drawing-room was large, elegant, and cold despite the fire burning. Penelope Hargrave sat by the window, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale but composed. "Miss Marple," she said in a controlled tone. "How kind of you to come. I was so very sorry to hear of last night," Miss Marple said gently. "Such a shock for everyone." "Yes," said Penelope, her gaze fixed on the snow outside. "A dreadful accident, eh?" said Miss Marple quietly. "You think it was an accident?" Penelope's eyes flickered to her wary. "Well, what else could it have been?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is precisely what one wonders." There was silence. The ticking of the mantel clock filled it. Then, perhaps sensing the futility of pretense, Penelope sighed. "You know what people will say, Miss Marple. They'll say I despised her, that I resented her, that my son's infatuation made me jealous." "Did you?" Miss Marple asked softly. Penelope looked startled. "Of course not. I only wanted the best for Peter. Miss Vaughan, Clarissa, she was charming, yes, but there was something unwholesome. She had a past. Women like that always do." "A past," repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. Such a vague term. It covers a great many possibilities. Penelope said nothing more, but her eyes hardened as she turned again toward the window. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl. "Thank you, my dear. I shan't disturb you further." As she left, she passed Peter Hargrave in the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He stopped her abruptly. "You don't believe it was an accident, do you, Miss Marple?" "I never say what I believe until I have reason," she said gently. "But tell me, Mr. Hargrave, how long had you known Miss Vaughan?" "Since September." "But it feels longer. I was going to propose after Christmas." He swallowed. "My mother hated her, said she'd only bring trouble, but Clarissa was kind. She made me feel alive, and yet," Miss Marple said softly, "someone wanted her silenced." His jaw tightened. "If you're suggesting—" "I suggest nothing, Mr. Hargrave, except that love is rarely as simple as it appears." She left him standing there, his fists clenched, his grief mingled with something else. Fear, perhaps. Or guilt. Dr. Blake's composure. Dr. Edmund Blake's surgery smelled faintly of antiseptic and pipe smoke. He received Miss Marple politely, though his eyes held a trace of wariness. "I've already spoken to Inspector Cray," he said. "He's asked me not to discuss the details until the coroner's report is complete." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said with a placid smile. "I merely wish to inquire after your health, Doctor. You must be terribly overworked." He relaxed slightly. "A bit of excitement, that's all. The body's being kept here until morning. Poison, I suppose?" she asked mildly. He blinked. "Why would you assume that?" "Oh," said Miss Marple innocently. "A dear friend of mine once collapsed quite similarly. At a whist drive, you know. Cyanide, it turned out. Bitter almonds." He stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're correct, Miss Marple. It does appear to have been cyanide. Fast-acting, instantaneous. We found traces on her gloves and lips." "Oh," she said softly. "Not in the wine, then?" He shook his head. "No. The cup she used was clean. It must have been transferred another way. Perhaps by touch," Miss Marple mused. "Or by a gift." Her eyes, bright and knowing, glanced toward his desk, where, quite coincidentally, a brooch lay on a cloth. The same silver snowflake she had seen clutched in Clarissa's hand. "Such a pretty trinket," she remarked casually. "Is that hers?" Dr. Blake hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, found in her glove. The pin was broken. Inspector thinks it may have pricked her skin." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "A most unusual accident." When she left Dr. Blake's calm expression had begun to fray ever so slightly. An evening at the vicarage. That evening, the village gathered for a subdued service at St. Mary's. Reverend Kent's sermon on the mystery of life and death trembled at the edges, his voice cracking once or twice. Beatrice Kent sat rigidly in the front pew, lips pursed. Afterward, Miss Marple joined them for tea in the vicarage parlour. The fire sputtered, and the tea was weak, but the company was informative. Mrs. Hargrave was never fond of Miss Vaughan, Beatrice declared, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigour. "Not that I blame her. That woman flaunted herself shamelessly. The way she smiled at men, really quite indecent. Miss Vaughan," Miss Marple said mildly, "was always most pleasant when I spoke with her." "Pleasant to men, perhaps," Beatrice snapped. Women saw through her. "Did they indeed?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And what exactly did they see?" "Ambition," Beatrice replied. "She wanted position. She knew Peter Hargrave would inherit everything one day. Women like her always do." Reverend Kent looked pained. "Beatrice, please." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Ambition," she repeated. "Such a dangerous word, isn't it? So often it means nothing more than wanting to be happy." She smiled, and Beatrice, feeling vaguely rebuked, fell silent. A quiet clue. When Miss Marple returned home, she placed the silver button she had found on the table beside her knitting basket. Next to it, she placed a note brooch, silver snowflake. Cyanide via pin. Button, expensive tailoring, likely London origin. Victim actress, rumored past. Possible connection, someone from before. She sat back, thoughtful. It was not the Hargraves who came to her mind just then, nor the Kents, nor even Dr. Blake. It was Clarissa herself, her grace, her mystery, her ease among strangers. Women like Clarissa carried their pasts lightly, but the past, Miss Marple knew, rarely allowed itself to be forgotten. Inspector Cray pays a call. The following morning, Inspector Cray arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. He was large, ruddy-faced, and good-hearted, but not particularly imaginative. He removed his hat respectfully. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd bring you up to date." "How kind." she said, motioning him to the armchair. Tea. Always? He grinned. So, poisoning confirmed, cyanide as you said, but here's the odd thing, no trace of it in her drink or food. Seems it was in that brooch she had. Clever, really. The pin was hollow, filled with the stuff, one prick, and, well, you saw. How ingenious, Miss Marple murmured. And someone gave it to her, I assume. He nodded grimly. Yes, wrapped up as a little Christmas gift. She opened it just before going on the ice. Do you know who gave it? Not yet. The wrapping paper's gone. Peter Hargraves swears it wasn't him. His mother says she never saw it. Dr. Blake handled it after she fell, so his prints are there, but that's all. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I see. Then the question becomes, not merely who gave it, but who knew she would put it on at that precise moment. The inspector frowned. Meaning, my dear inspector, said Miss Marple, that the murderer planned not only the method, but the performance, a most theatrical crime. In Miss Marple's reflection that night, as the wind howled softly outside, Miss Marple sat by her fire, lost in thought. Theatrical. Yes, that was the word. Clarissa Vaughan, the supposed actress, dying in the very center of a glittering ice rink, before the eyes of the entire village, just as the lights shone brightest. Whoever killed her had an instinct for drama. Perhaps even for irony. She thought again of the silver button, the London tailoring, the precision of the poisoned brooch. Not a crime of passion, a crime of planning. But what motive could justify such planning? Jealousy? Pride? Fear? She thought of Penelope Hargrave's frozen composure, Peter's trembling hands, Dr. Blake's too steady eyes, Beatrice's venomous tongue. So many small motives, but none yet large enough. Then she remembered something Reverend Kent had said, almost absent-mindedly. She'd been rehearsing for something in London, before she came here. Rehearsing. Miss Marple smiled. Perhaps she had not only a past, she murmured, but a visitor from it. The stage clue, the next morning, brought confirmation of her suspicion. The postmistress, Mrs. Finch, came bustling up Old Mill Lane, breathless with news. Miss Marple. You'll never guess! They say a gentleman came asking after Miss Vaughan last week. Smart-looking chap, London coat, stayed one night at the inn. Called himself Mr. Lionel Dean. Missy. Dean, Miss Marple repeated. How curious. Yes. And now he's vanished, left before breakfast the next morning. The landlord found a theatre program in his room. Clarissa's name on it! She was in some play years ago. The Winter Masquerade. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. A masquerade indeed. She thanked Mrs. Finch and went back inside, thoughtful. The pieces were slowly aligning. A brooch sent as a gift, a visitor from her theatrical past, a death timed for spectacle. And yet, someone local must have handled that brooch, someone who knew it would be given to Clarissa at the rink. Her eyes rested on her notebook. Beneath the names she had written, she now added 2 more lines: gift arranged beforehand, local hand, outside connection, Dr. Blake's composure, unnatural, Mrs. Hargrave's absence during the skating, coincidence or convenience. She set down her pen, folded her hands, and smiled faintly. The stage is set, she murmured. Now we shall see who steps forward for the final act. The following afternoon brought a stillness to St. Crispin's Hollow that was almost eerie. The snow, which had fallen heavily the night before, now lay like a soft white shroud over the cottages and lanes, muffling every sound. The villagers went about their errands quietly, subdued by the shock of Charles Denham's sudden death. At the vicarage, however, the air hummed with subdued tension. Miss Marple, seated in her usual chair by the window, was engaged in gentle conversation with Inspector Graves. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and the smell of fresh tea hung pleasantly in the air. The inspector's notebook rested on his knee. He looked tired but determined. It's all very odd, Miss Marple, he said, tapping his pencil. The coroner's initial report confirms what we suspected. Poisoning. Arsenic, most likely. Traces found in the chocolate remnants near the rink. Not a large dose, but enough considering Denham's age. Miss Marple stirred her tea with quiet precision. Chocolate, she murmured. A curious choice of delivery. It suggests a degree of familiarity. One does not accept such a treat from just anyone, particularly at a public gathering. Exactly, said Graves. We've questioned the villagers who were closest to him during the skating. Miss Waverley said she saw him eating from a small box of chocolates near the tea tent. Young Michael admitted handing him one, at Mr. Denham's request, but says he didn't know where they came from. Mrs. Denham insists she brought no chocolates herself, and as for Miss Waverley, he frowned. She claims she had only toffees. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "How very human," she said softly. "People so rarely recall small details accurately when under stress. The truth hides most comfortably among the ordinary." 1. The village begins to gossip. By mid-afternoon, the village was buzzing. The general consensus, in hushed tones at the grocer's and the post office, was that Charles Denham had been "done in," though by whom and why were matters of gleeful speculation. Mrs. Larkin, the postmistress, told anyone who would listen that she had never trusted that Mrs. Denham, while old Mr. Tebb, the blacksmith, insisted that these rich types always bring trouble when they come slumming it in the country. Miss Marple, however, kept her counsel. She listened, she smiled, and she tucked away each morsel of gossip as though storing breadcrumbs for later. In the evening, she paid a quiet visit to the rectory, ostensibly to bring Mrs. Graves a jar of her rose-hip jam. But once the pleasantries were over, she found herself drawn into conversation again with the inspector, who seemed increasingly perplexed. "You see, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his temple, "we've established the poison wasn't self-administered. Denham's fingerprints alone were on the chocolate box. Yet, it appears the box wasn't his. No one remembers him carrying it before he arrived at the rink. And there's the odd business of his will." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "His will?" "Yes, his solicitor confirmed that a revised will was signed last week, leaving a considerable sum to Miss Waverley. Quite the scandal, considering his estrangement from his wife." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with restrained amusement. "Dear me, how like life to present us with motives wrapped in the guise of kindness." "And then," Graves continued, "there's the matter of Miss Waverley's past. I did a little digging. It seems she was once dismissed from a teaching post for, how shall I put it, over-familiarity with a wealthy patron. Nothing proven, but the pattern feels familiar." Miss Marple nodded, fingers clasped lightly over her teacup. "Ah yes, some natures are drawn irresistibly to comfort, whether of affection or finance. Yet I suspect she is but one thread in a larger weave." 2. A visit to Waverley Lodge the next morning dawned bright and brittle, the sunlight glinting off the frozen pond and snow-laden hedgerows. Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in her grey shawl, decided that a brisk walk to Waverley Lodge might serve both her health and her curiosity. The lodge was a charmingly restored Georgian cottage, its garden still adorned with traces of last night's frost. Miss Waverley herself answered the door, her smile wide but unsteady. "Miss Marple, what a surprise. Do come in. The house is frightfully cold this morning." Inside, the sitting room was tastefully furnished, though the fire burned low. Miss Marple noticed a framed photograph of Charles Denham on the mantel. An image of him in younger days, handsome and confident. "A tragic business," Miss Waverley sighed, offering tea. "Poor Charles, I can hardly believe he's gone." And Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Yes, quite dreadful. And so sudden. One wonders how such a thing could happen on so festive a day." Miss Waverley hesitated. "It's too horrible. The police have been questioning everyone. I know what they must think, that I had something to gain. But truly, Miss Marple, I cared for Charles. He was kind to me, after what I'd been through." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is never easy to lose a friend, my dear. But sometimes kindness and affection blur together in ways that others may misread." The younger woman bit her lip. I suppose so." As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by the window. A half-empty box of chocolates rested on the sill, different from the one at the rink, but of the same brand. She made a mental note of the label Beauchamp's fine assortment. 3. An unexpected discovery later that day. Miss Marple stopped by the post office under pretense of purchasing stamps. Behind the counter, Mrs. Larkin was in full gossiping mode. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll never guess. That young lad Michael's in quite the state. His poor mother says he's been muttering all sorts about the chocolates. Something about fetching them from the vicar's tent, he says." "The vicar's tent," said Miss Marple mildly. "At the rink?" "Yes, apparently someone told him to fetch a box of sweets from a parcel left on the table. Said they were for Mr. Denham. He can't remember who it was though. Poor boy's beside himself." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Indeed, how very curious." She left the shop deep in thought. The box had not been Mr. Denham's, that much was certain, and yet someone had ensured it reached him, someone who knew the routine, the bustle, the confusion of that Christmas afternoon. By evening, she found herself once again in the company of Inspector Graves, who looked considerably more weary than before. "We've spoken to the boy," he said. "He swears it was a woman who told him to take the chocolates to Denham." but he can't recall her face. Says she was wearing a red scarf and mittens. Half the women in the village were wearing red that day. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Ah yes, red. The color of cheer and concealment both. Mrs. Denham's maid recalls her mistress wearing a red scarf, Graves added darkly, and so did Miss Waverley. Even Mrs. Cartwright, the organizer, had one. Miss Marple's smile was faint and knowing. And so, you see, my dear Inspector, we have reached the part of the story where everyone could be guilty, and therefore, one must think who needed to be. 4. Secrets begin to surface over the next 2 days. Small truths began to seep out like water through cracks in the ice. Mrs. Denham, it seemed, had not been entirely truthful about her whereabouts during the Rink festivities. She had claimed to be serving tea when her husband collapsed, but 2 witnesses recalled seeing her walking briskly toward the car park just before the commotion began. Mr. Cartwright, the tea organizer, was discovered to have a private debt to Denham, a rather large one, relating to a failed business venture years ago. His alibi was managing the raffle, but no one remembered seeing him do so. Miss Waverley, meanwhile, had received not only a mention in the will, but also a generous Christmas gift from Denham, a pearl brooch, valued at over £50. And yet, despite all this, something still nagged at Miss Marple's mind. It was too obvious, too tidy. On the 3rd evening, she invited Mrs. Cartwright to tea. The woman arrived flustered and tearful. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what to think any more. The inspector says it's poisoning, and that means someone must have planned it. But who in our quiet little village could be capable of such a dreadful thing?" Miss Marple poured tea, and looked at her gently. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Cartwright, human nature is much the same everywhere. It is only the opportunities that differ. But Charles, he could be difficult, yes, but not deserving of that. My husband says he'd been threatening to expose something, though he won't tell me what. Expose something. Yes. Something about the vicarage fund, I think. There was money missing last year. Small amounts, but enough to cause embarrassment if discovered." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Ah, so we have kindness, jealousy, debt and fear. 4 strings, each capable of strangling truth." 5. The candlelight revelation that night. As the snow fell thick and silent once more, Miss Marple sat by her fire knitting a soft blue scarf. Her mind was quietly alight. She thought of the chocolates. Where they had come from, who had handled them, who had reason to ensure they reached Charles Denham. She thought of the revised will, of Miss Waverley's distress, of Mrs. Denham's cold composure. Then she remembered something almost trivial during the first interviews. Mrs. Denham had claimed not to like chocolate. "Too sweet," she'd said. Yet, at the Christmas Eve the year before, Miss Marple distinctly remembered her delight at receiving a tin of truffles. It was a small inconsistency, but in Miss Marple's experience, such details often revealed the larger deceit. The next morning she took a short walk to the vicarage and requested a word with Inspector Graves. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe you are looking for the wrong motive. Not love nor inheritance nor money. The answer, I think, lies in pride." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Pride, Miss Marple?" "Yes, pride in reputation, in appearance, in ensuring that one's husband, or wife, never makes one look a fool." The inspector stared at her for a long moment. "Are you saying Mrs. Denham?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am not saying. I am observing. But perhaps, if you were to inquire about the household's medicine cabinet, you might find something of interest missing. A small bottle, once containing rat poison perhaps. You believe she poisoned him. Let us not rush, but it would be prudent to see whether that bottle is gone, or recently replaced." Graves rose at once, grabbing his coat. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes reflecting both compassion and certainty. 6. A second shocking event. But before Graves could act, another shock rippled through the village. Mrs. Denham was found unconscious in her drawing room, a half-empty brandy glass on the table beside her. The doctor declared it an overdose of sleeping draught, deliberate, it seemed. A suicide note lay nearby, confessing to terrible guilt and begging forgiveness. The inspector's conclusion was immediate. Case closed. He told Miss Marple that afternoon. Guilt drove her to it. The note confirms everything. The rat poison bottle was indeed missing. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "How convenient," she murmured. "And yet, how unconvincing." "Unconvincing. Yes. For guilt, Inspector, speaks in many tongues, but rarely in perfect sentences on fresh stationery." Graves blinked. "You think it's false?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that we have been led by the nose. Someone wished for Mrs. Denham to take the blame, or failing that, to be silenced. But who? Ah, that is the question. And the answer, I suspect, lies not in poison but in paper. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the snow was falling once more, white, silent, and deceptive. 7. The final clue 2 days later, while sorting through some of the late Mr. Denham's belongings at the vicarage, temporarily stored there for convenience, Miss Marple made a small but decisive discovery. Among the papers was a letter, torn, half-burned, but still legible enough to read a name at the bottom. It was addressed to, "My dearest Lillian," and signed, Arthur Cartwright. The letter hinted at affection, perhaps even something improper, though couched in cautious terms. It seemed Charles Denham had discovered this correspondence, and that his threat to expose something might have had nothing to do with village funds, but with the moral standing of his good friend's wife. Miss Marple sat back, eyes narrowing. "Ah," she whispered. The delicate balance of appearances again. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her reticule. The time had come, she decided, for a little gathering. The village of St. Crispin's Hollow had never felt quite so hushed. Snow still clung stubbornly to the hedgerows, though the sky had turned a brittle grey. The Christmas cheer of only a week ago seemed now a distant echo, a memory wrapped in frost. Inside the vicarage drawing-room, however, warmth and quiet determination reigned. A fire crackled gently, tea steamed invitingly, and in her habitual armchair sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting on her lap, her blue eyes alight with thought. Inspector Graves stood at the mantel, arms folded. He looked both puzzled and weary. "So you truly think Mrs. Denham wasn't responsible, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing mid-stitch. "No, Inspector, I do not. I think she was meant to appear responsible. That is a very different thing." "But the suicide note, forged," said Miss Marple simply. "A clumsy imitation, too measured, too perfect. True remorse, you know, is rarely grammatical." Graves blinked, uncertain whether she was jesting, but Miss Marple's expression was serene, serious even. "You see, Inspector," she continued, "there are 3 lies at the heart of this affair. The first concerns who brought the chocolates. The second, why Charles Denham changed his will. And the third, most vital of all, who stood to lose everything if his reputation were damaged. Once you follow those threads, the pattern becomes most revealing. You're saying it wasn't about the money." "Not money, no. Something far more fragile, and therefore far more dangerous: respectability." She glanced up at the clock on the mantelpiece, its pendulum swinging with quiet precision. "If you would be so good, Inspector, I should like to invite a few people here this afternoon. A little gathering, you might say. I believe it is time to restore peace to St. Crispin's Hollow." 1. The gathering at the vicarage by 4 o'clock. The drawing-room was filled with subdued tension. The key figures had all assembled, each under the impression that the meeting was official police business. Mrs. Cartwright sat stiffly on the settee, her gloved hands twisting a handkerchief. Her husband stood beside her, his ruddy face pale beneath its usual color. Miss Waverley perched nervously near the window, her eyes darting between the others. At the far end of the room, Inspector Graves busied himself with notes, while Miss Marple, serene as ever, poured tea into delicate china cups. "We are all agreed," she began pleasantly, "that poor Mr. Denham's death has cast a long shadow over our little community. But shadows, like lies, disappear in the proper light." No one spoke. Only the fire crackled. "Let us begin," said Miss Marple, "with the chocolates." She placed a small box upon the table, the familiar Beauchamp's fine assortment. This box, as the inspector has confirmed, contained arsenic-laced sweets. It was not Mr. Denham's, though it was made to appear so. Young Michael, the errand boy, was told to fetch it from the vicar's tent and deliver it to him. But the person who gave that instruction, a woman wearing red, was never identified. Curious, don't you think? Mrs. Cartwright let out a nervous laugh. Half the village wore red that day. Miss Marple, I myself, indeed, said Miss Marple gently, and so did Miss Waverley, and Mrs. Denham. But only one of you, Mrs. Cartwright, was seen leaving the vicar's tent precisely when Michael entered. Mrs. Cartwright froze. Her husband turned sharply to her. Nonsense, she stammered. I went to fetch more tickets for the raffle. Yes, Miss Marple nodded. That was your claim. Yet no one recalls you returning with them, nor were the extra tickets ever found. I suspect, my dear, that you fetched something else entirely. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Are you suggesting Mrs. Cartwright placed the poisoned chocolates? placed them. No, said Miss Marple softly. She delivered them. But the poison itself, that came from another hand. The silence deepened. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath, too. The hidden motive. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her voice calm but compelling. Mr. Denham, as we now know, had discovered something quite private and potentially ruinous. The assumption was that he meant to expose financial impropriety regarding the vicarage fund. But that, I'm afraid, was a convenient rumor. The truth was rather more personal. Her eyes rested briefly on Mr. Cartwright. Hay had come upon a letter, an affectionate one, from you, Mr. Cartwright, to Mrs. Denham. A collective gasp broke the room's stillness. Mrs. Cartwright turned to her husband, eyes wide with disbelief. Arthur, is this true? Mr. Cartwright's face had gone chalk white. It was years ago, he said hoarsely. A foolish thing, meant nothing, he found it somehow. Threatened to tell my wife. Said I was a hypocrite. I begged him to let it be. Indeed, said Miss Marple. And so the motive begins to take shape. But of course you could hardly kill him yourself, could you, Mr. Cartwright? Too obvious. Too risky. You needed someone else to handle the poison. Someone easily influenced, perhaps even unknowing. Her gaze drifted toward Mrs. Cartwright. A loyal wife. A wife who would do anything to protect her husband's good name. The Mrs. Cartwright let out a strangled sob. I didn't know it was poison! I swear it! He said the chocolates were to be a peace offering, to smooth things over after some disagreement. He said Mr. Denham was fond of them, and I must be the one to deliver them. He said, yes, Miss Marple interrupted gently, and you trusted him, as any devoted wife might. Only when the truth began to emerge, when suspicion turned toward Mrs. Denham, your husband panicked. He forged the suicide note to seal the illusion. Clever, but not clever enough. Inspector Graves's pencil trembled in his hand. Then it was Mr. Cartwright who... Yes, said Miss Marple firmly. He laced the chocolates with arsenic, relying on his wife's good nature to deliver them. It was simple, elegant and cruel. But he misjudged two things. First, Mrs. Denham's unexpected attempt to take her own life, out of despair, no doubt, after public suspicion. And second, my memory, your memory. Miss Marple smiled. You see, last Christmas, at the very same FT, Mr. Cartwright won a raffle prize, a basket containing, among other things, a tin of Beauchamp's fine assortment. He remarked at the time that they were too rich for his taste. I imagine the tin remained somewhere in his home. Convenient, when he needed a box to disguise his handiwork. Mr. Cartwright's mouth opened, then closed again. His wife stared at him in horror. Arthur, she whispered, tell me it isn't true. But he said nothing. 3. Miss Marple's quiet trap. Miss Marple's tone remained kindly, almost regretful. You see, my dear Mr. Cartwright, you relied upon chaos and pity to cloak your guilt. But human nature, I've always found, has a way of betraying its own designs. A man may act with cunning, but he cannot quite hide his fear of discovery. Fear, he snapped, a trace of his old bluster returning. You've no proof, only stories. Miss Marple smiled mildly. Stories are the bones upon which truth rests. But if you require something more substantial, Inspector Graves found your fingerprints upon the tin's inner lid this morning. Graves nodded grimly. We searched your study, Mr. Cartwright. The lid was hidden in your desk drawer, beneath some correspondence. It matches the poison box precisely. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Cartwright rose unsteadily, her face pale but resolute. Arthur, she whispered, I would have forgiven almost anything. But this, using me. Mr. Cartwright sank heavily into a chair, his head in his hands. He'd have ruined me, he muttered. Everything I'd built, everything I'd stood for, he deserved. No one deserves poison, Mr. Cartwright, said Miss Marple gently. That sort of reasoning belongs to men who play at justice, not those who understand it. The Graves cleared his throat. You'll come with me now, sir. As he led the trembling man from the room, the silence that followed was almost tender. The fire crackled softly. Outside a bell tolled 6 o'clock, the hour of evensong, for Miss Marple and Miss Waverley. When the others had departed, only Miss Waverley remained. She looked shaken but relieved. Miss Marple, she said quietly, I scarcely know how to thank you. I was so certain they'd hang this on me. Miss Marple smiled kindly. My dear, guilt often seeks the nearest shadow. You were convenient, that's all. It must have been dreadful. It was, but I can't help feeling sorry for Mr. Cartwright. Indeed, said Miss Marple. She is a woman who believed that protecting one's husband is the same as loving him. It is a common confusion, I fear. Miss Waverley hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you ever tire of seeing so much deceit, Miss Marple?" "Oh, my dear," said Miss Marple with a faint chuckle, "one grows accustomed. Deceit, after all, is merely truth wearing a holiday mask, but kindness when it appears is quite unmistakable, and far rarer." 5. The inspector's gratitude. Later that evening, Inspector Graves returned to the vicarage to thank Miss Marple. He looked both impressed and faintly sheepish. "You know," he said, "I was certain it was the wife. All the signs pointed that way, but you saw through it from the start." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, not from the start, Inspector. Only once I noticed how neatly everything fit. Life, you know, is rarely so tidy." "Well," said Graves, "I've learned more from watching you work than from a dozen Scotland Yard lectures." "You are kind to say so," Miss Marple replied, pouring him a final cup of tea. "But it was really very simple. Human nature, Inspector. It never quite changes. Only the scenery does." He smiled ruefully. "You make it sound almost predictable." "In some ways it is," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Pride, envy, love, fear, always the same old quartet, playing new tunes. One simply learns to listen to the melody beneath the noise." 6. Epilogue. The skating pond once more. A week later, the ice rink reopened. The tragedy had faded, as tragedies always do, into something polite and distant, spoken of in low tones, punctuated by sighs and shakes of the head. Miss Marple stood by the railing, wrapped warmly in her shawl, watching the children skate once more. Their laughter rose into the crisp air like bells. Mrs. Denham, pale but composed, passed by and paused to speak. "I owe you more than I can say, Miss Marple. The truth might never have been known without you." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "My dear, truth is a most persistent guest. It always finds its way in, sooner or later." As Mrs. Denham walked away, Miss Marple's eyes softened. The sunlight gleamed upon the frozen surface, turning it to silver. She thought of human hearts, how fragile, how transparent, how easily cracked when pride and love war within them. Then, with a small, satisfied sigh, she turned toward home. After all, there was tea to be had and a new skein of wool waiting to be wound. And life, as she well knew, always continued, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully, even after death on the Christmas Rink. The drawing room of Mapleford Hall was dimly lit by the dying embers of a great fire. Outside, the snow fell gently, whispering against the windows as though the world itself wished to hush in anticipation of what was to come. Within, 5 faces were pale, drawn tight with apprehension. Miss Marple sat upright in a high-backed chair, her knitting in her lap, though notably, no knitting needles moved. Her eyes, sharp and serene, moved from one anxious face to another. Colonel Redgrave, the master of the house, sat stiffly, a decanter of port untouched before him. Beside him, his wife, Eleanor, clutched a lace handkerchief as though it were a lifeline. Inspector Craddock stood by the hearth, notepad in hand, his expression both expectant and respectful. Across from them sat the others, the glacially beautiful Veronica Elcott, pale as porcelain, the boyish Michael Trent, face flushed and defiant, and lastly, the trembling figure of Mrs. Partridge, her eyes darting from Miss Marple to the door, as if plotting an escape. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly, a sound so gentle it commanded immediate silence. "Now," she began, "I suppose you are all wondering why I have asked you to remain. It is, after all, Christmas Eve, and under ordinary circumstances, one would prefer to be gathered by the fire in peace. But we are not under ordinary circumstances." Her tone was calm, almost kindly, yet it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "We are, I fear, in the company of a murderer." A collective intake of breath echoed around the room. Inspector Craddock's brow furrowed. "You're quite certain, Miss Marple?" "Quite," she said, folding her hands neatly. "Poor Mr. Hammond did not perish from mere accident on that ice. Nor did he fall, as some have hoped to believe. He was, in the truest and saddest sense, assisted into eternity." Mrs. Redgrave made a small, strangled sound. Veronica Elcott gave a low laugh, dry, brittle, and defensive. "Surely you can't mean one of us." "Good heavens, Miss Marple, the whole village was there. It was an accident, pure and simple." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Accidents, my dear, are rare things when strong motives abound. One might call them the refuge of the guilty, and the comfort of the naive." Her eyes softened, as if to take the sting out of her words. "1. The hidden truth. I have watched," Miss Marple went on quietly, "and listened, as I always do. I am old and therefore quite invisible, you see. People talk freely before one who seems more interested in her knitting than the world around her. And so, I have heard and seen a great deal." She looked toward Colonel Redgrave. Colonel, you had much to lose if Mr. Hammond carried out his plans to purchase the old mill property. It would have ruined your timber contract, would it not? Redgrave's jaw tightened. Damn it, yes, but I wouldn't kill a man over business. Of course not, Miss Marple said soothingly. A man of honor would find another way. And besides, your alibi places you quite firmly at the refreshment tent with the vicar's wife at the time of the incident. No, yours is not the hand that dealt death that night. Her eyes moved to Michael Trent. You, however, Mr. Trent, had a quarrel with Mr. Hammond only an hour before his death. Witnesses heard it quite clearly. Michael flushed. He insulted my father. Called him a thief and a cheat. Any man would have said something back. Indeed, Miss Marple nodded. A son defending his late father's honor. Very admirable. But passion can cloud reason, can it not? Still, your confrontation was quite public, and I think not the sort of moment a killer would choose. No, young men act rashly, but they rarely plan carefully enough for such things. Her gaze settled upon Veronica Elcott. The woman's lips curved faintly, though her knuckles whitened around her teacup. Mrs. Elcott, Miss Marple said gently, you knew Mr. Hammond quite well in your London days, did you not? A fact you've gone to some trouble to conceal. Veronica's poise faltered for the first time. That's absurd. As it? Miss Marple's tone remained mild. He recognized you immediately. His surprise was evident when he saw you upon the rink. You turned quite pale, I noticed, though the air was not particularly cold at that moment. Veronica's voice hardened. You're implying something indecent. Nothing of the sort, Miss Marple said. But I am implying that your past association gave Mr. Hammond a certain leverage over you. Perhaps he knew something you'd rather he kept silent. Veronica said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes, too. The poison beneath the ice. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Miss Marple, the pathologist found traces of a sedative in Mr. Hammond's blood. Not enough to kill him, but enough to make him dizzy. Unsteady. It seems he'd been drugged before stepping onto the rink. Precisely, Miss Marple said. That was the key. The ice did not kill him. His body did the rest when it struck the frozen surface. But the sedative ensured that he could not save himself from the fall. Mrs. Partridge gasped audibly. Oh heavens, how dreadful. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, dreadful indeed. But even dreadful things leave traces. The cup of mulled wine he drank before skating was not served by the official vendors. It came, in fact, from a private flask. One given him by someone he trusted. Her blue eyes turned toward Mrs. Partridge. You, Mrs. Partridge, brought him the drink. You were seen walking across the rink with it only moments before his fall. The woman's face drained of color. Yes, but he asked for it. He said he was cold. I didn't. Oh, dear God. I didn't know what was in it. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. No, I dare say you didn't. You were merely the messenger. Mrs. Partridge's trembling intensified. Then who? 3. The clever substitution. Ah, said Miss Marple, that is where the matter becomes quite interesting. You see, Mr. Hammond was something of a bully. His charm, like so many such men, was of the type that wears thin in a small community. He'd alienated nearly everyone in Mapleford, except those who still needed something from him. Miss Marple paused, eyes softening with reflection. One learns, living long as I have, that greed and fear are often the strongest of motives. And in this case, both were at play. She turned again to Veronica. You had every reason to hate him, Mrs. Elcott. He had once been your lover, had he not? And when he deserted you, you married for security. Yet you never forgave him. Veronica's face was like marble. You have quite the imagination. Perhaps, Miss Marple smiled, but imagination, when combined with observation, can be a very dangerous thing. You arrived at the rink with your husband's silver flask. A gift, I believe, filled with brandy. I gave it to Mr. Hammond as a gesture of peace, she protested. He'd accused me of snobbery. I thought it best to show goodwill. Miss Marple's voice remained almost kindly. So you said. But the contents of the flask were not merely brandy. A small dose of chloral hydrate had been added, enough to make him light-headed. You knew, of course, that he planned to skate immediately afterward. It would look like a tragic fall. Silence fell like a shroud. Eleanor Redgrave gave a cry. You wicked woman! Veronica stood abruptly, trembling. You've no proof! None. Miss Marple nodded toward Craddock. Inspector, you'll find the empty packet of chloral hydrate in the drawer of Mrs. Elcott's dressing table. She purchased it from the chemist under her maiden name, Veronica Merton. 2 weeks ago, citing difficulty sleeping. Craddock gave a curt nod. We'll check immediately. 4. The motive unveiled. Miss Marple's voice grew quieter, though no less firm. He was blackmailing you, wasn't he? That's why you came to Mapleford at all. He had letters. Foolish, romantic letters from years ago. Your husband never knew. Hammond found them and threatened to ruin you. But you could not allow that. Not after all the years you'd spent building a life of respectability. Veronica's shoulders slumped. Her voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. He said he'd send them to my husband, said he'd expose me for what I'd been. I offered him money. He laughed. Tears glistened on her cheeks. I only meant to frighten him, to make him ill for a time. Never to kill him, I swear it. Miss Marple's expression softened. Yes, I believe that. But once you tamper with such things, the rest is beyond your control. He took more than you expected, or the cold intensified the effect. Death came swiftly, silently, on that glittering ice. Veronica sank into her chair, covering her face. 5. The final reflection. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, his usual gruffness tempered with respect. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Every time I think you've retired from detecting, you remind me that age hasn't dulled your wits in the slightest. She smiled faintly. Oh, my dear Inspector, one doesn't retire from noticing things. It's rather like breathing. You simply go on doing it. Colonel Redgrave poured her a small glass of port and set it beside her. You've saved this house from disgrace, Miss Marple. I can't imagine how we might ever thank you. Just keep the ice rink closed until after the thaw, she said mildly. 1 murder per Christmas is quite enough for any village. They laughed softly, though the sound was subdued, touched with sorrow. Outside, the church bells began to chime for midnight mass. Miss Marple rose, fastening her shawl. Come now, she said gently. It's Christmas Day. Even amidst tragedy we must not forget to be kind to one another. As she left the hall, the snow deepened, covering all traces of the rink where so much had ended. The lights of Mapleford glowed faintly through the white curtain of winter, and Miss Marple's small figure disappeared into it like a wisp of memory. In her heart, she reflected, as she often did, that human sin and folly were not so unlike the snow, soft and beautiful on the surface, yet dangerous when one trades without care. And, she murmured to herself as she walked toward the church, it's always the smallest crack in the ice that gives way first.